Hello again, everybody, and welcome to the third of the recordings dealing with the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Up to this point, we've talked about everything all the way through Nixon's victory in the 1968 election. Fairly comfortable victory in the election. The Nixon presidencies then are really complicated. We've talked about some of the sort of ups and downs of the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Nixon's are even more complex in a number of ways. We won't go into a lot of details about Nixon's time in office. He is, on the one hand, certainly successful at cooling some of the tensions of the Cold War. He is responsible for overseeing the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. He opens relations with China, which had been a sort of source of international tension between the United States and the Chinese government for decades, really ever since China became communist in 1949. So Nixon achieves a number of fairly significant kinds of policy developments and foreign affairs developments, diplomatic developments. Nixon also is partially responsible for drawing Americans out of Vietnam. So there are a number of things that we can certainly give him credit for. Nixon is also president during potentially one of the worst political scandals in American history, right? There have been a number of things happening in American history in terms of presidential abuses of power that sort of vie with the Watergate scandal for being evidence of the worst examples of sort of presidential misbehavior, let's say, malfeasance. But Nixon's presidency then, again, it's a significant period in American history. And so we'll start, because this is kind of the sort of boogeyman of the 1960s in a lot of ways, with Vietnam. Talked a little bit about the Tet Offensive, which really does spell the beginning of the end for America's commitment to the Vietnam War. Certainly, there are still hundreds of thousands of Americans in Vietnam and near Vietnam during the 1968, 69, 70 time period. But when Johnson refuses to run in 1968, and when Nixon campaigns, he presents his argument that the United States needs to find a way out of Vietnam, and he calls it achieving peace with honor. This is, when he's talking about it, he's not really making it clear what his plan is. It's sort of a catchy phrase that voters at the time are going to respond to. Voters really like catchy phrases, it seems. He then decides, once he's in office, to pursue kind of a two-pronged approach. For one, he undertakes a much more concentrated effort to negotiate with the North Vietnamese government to find a path to ending the war. He also decides to draw down American involvement in the war by increasingly handing over that responsibility to the South Vietnamese army itself. He calls this Vietnamization. Vietnamization is ensuring that the South Vietnamese army will be given sufficient training, sufficient material support, sufficient logistical and communications support, but ultimately, Nixon says, this will end up being your war to prevent the North Vietnamese from taking South Vietnam. So rather than the American military being responsible for maintaining South Vietnam's quote-unquote independence, it's going to be South Vietnam's responsibility. At the same time, he expands America's involvement to a certain degree on the ground, but especially by air, in Cambodia and Laos. So he widens the bombing campaign. He sends the American military into Cambodia in a sort of a limited invasion, which by all appearances seems to completely contradict his statements that he is reducing the American involvement in Southeast Asia. In reality, this is actually a reduction in overall commitment, but it includes a particular expansion of a particular part of the war, which sets off a lot of alarm bells, including widespread demonstrations in and around college campuses throughout the country, including the demonstrations at Kent State University that result in the deaths of 4 people. There are also demonstrations at Jackson State University in Mississippi, where another 2 people are killed. Campuses then are shut down across the country. It is another sort of iconic moment in the anti-war movement, the demonstrations protesting the war itself. Ultimately, America's involvement then comes to an end by March of 1973. Agreements are reached in Paris, where the United States agrees to withdraw its remaining military personnel. This then basically opens the door for the North Vietnamese army to advance deeper and deeper into the south, so that by the spring of 1975, South Vietnam collapses entirely. The North Vietnamese army captures the capital city of Saigon and unifies or reunifies Vietnam under the control of the North. And so this then officially brings to an end America's decades-long commitment in the Vietnam War, first aiding the French, ultimately then bearing the brunt of the responsibility of maintaining South Vietnamese independence. This then is, by some measures, of course, sort of a feather in Nixon's cap in terms of finally achieving this kind of solution to the Vietnam crisis. And the top photographs are images of the fall of Saigon as the American embassy is finally sort of evacuated in April of 1975. Hundreds and hundreds of Vietnamese try to make their way onto the last helicopters leaving the city. Those helicopters then are flown out to warships in the South China Sea. Certainly not all of these people make it. There are definitely hundreds and thousands of South Vietnamese citizens that had connections in one way or another to the American presence and weren't able to be evacuated. The bottom image then, of course, is the Kent State incident, right? So the National Guard in the foreground, the student demonstrators then in the background, leading ultimately then to the killings of 4 students and wounding several others in an incident in May of 1970. So Nixon's presidency is certainly sort of a hit or miss moment. He wins in 1968 and then sort of continues that campaign in 1972 by appealing to what he calls the silent majority, right? This is a group of people really characterized by conservatives or people who are alienated by what they perceive as a youth movement going off the rails. that this is a moment to sort of restore traditional American values, to, you know, be proud in America's history and America's role in the world. So concerned that young people in the country aren't patriotic enough, aren't taking America seriously enough, are too willing to criticize the country in the face of all of the good that it has done and is doing. And so this is, as you can probably tell, very similar to the kinds of sort of culture war campaigning that is fairly common in politics these days. There is also very much a reaction among especially white middle class voters and white lower class voters against the kinds of economic and social and political stresses that the Great Society program and the Vietnam War have really unleashed. So there are reactions to the idea that the Great Society is providing handouts to minorities who aren't really working to achieve those kinds of benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So this is a very, very successful, very popular kind of campaign strategy. And the Nixon strategy is really going to help solidify certain voting blocs as being supportive of the Republican Party. And this is going to be a successful kind of tactic for Reagan in his campaigns in 80 and 84. It's going to be a successful strategy then for Bush in his campaigns, George W. Bush in particular, his campaigns in 2000 and 2004. And it certainly was going to be a successful campaign strategy for Trump in 16. And it resulted in a lot of Trump's votes in the 2020 election, kind of talking in very similar ways in a lot of respects. Economically speaking, the country is struggling in the late 60s and into the early 70s. The economic bubble or sort of bulge that the country had seen during the post-war years is beginning to burst. So there is rampant inflation. It continues all the way into the 1970s. There is a fairly brief but fairly debilitating oil embargo by OPEC, right? The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. That's what OPEC stands for. And this causes huge oil shortages throughout the country as people have to wait in line for hours at a time in order to get a few gallons of gasoline. Prices skyrocket as a result. And so there are definitely significant kinds of economic challenges that are going to continue and will plague Nixon's administration, will plague Ford's administration, and will plague Carter's administration throughout the entire 1970s. But really, in many ways, the sort of story of the 1970s is going to be Watergate. Watergate is the scandal that will ultimately lead Nixon to resign the presidency in the face of almost certain impeachment. Basically, what happens is Nixon and his campaign advisors for the 1972 election decide that they're going to spy, essentially, on the Democratic Party and the campaign of McGovern, who is the candidate for the Democratic Party, Eugene McGovern. In the early 1970s, there was a very sort of well-publicized leak of thousands and thousands of pages of papers from the presidencies of Kennedy and Johnson in their interactions with the Pentagon, primarily about how the Vietnam War was going to be described or how it was going to be spun. And while these were not necessarily in any way going to sort of reflect badly on Nixon's administration, Nixon and his national security advisor, a man named Henry Kissinger, end up deciding that they need to prosecute the whistleblowers who were responsible for releasing all of these pages of otherwise classified information, and targeting the media for the way that the media handled the release of the Pentagon Papers. And so the White House goes on to compile this list of enemies, as Nixon calls them, journalists and politicians who seem to oppose Nixon personally or oppose the Nixon administration more generally. And this sort of paranoid approach to politics contributes to the decision to bug the phones of the Democratic National Committee, and steal paperwork and steal information from the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. Now, that office happened to be in the Watergate building, right? The Watergate building in Washington, D.C. was this kind of mixed-use property. It had a hotel. Well, it's still there today. It has a hotel, it has apartments, it has office space, so on and so on. And this is where the Democratic National Committee had its headquarters. The burglars are caught. The people who were there to steal these files and to bug the phones were caught. Over time, the full involvement of the Nixon presidency and Nixon himself begins to unravel. And he is brought up on charges in the House of Representatives. Impeachment proceedings are begun. Nixon then resigns before that impeachment process can get full steam, and almost certainly would have resulted in his expulsion from the presidency. But he resigns before that happens. This is a bipartisan affair, right? This is Republicans and Democrats that come together in the interest of maintaining sort of the ethical standing of the presidency, the office of the presidency. Impeachment will end up not always operating in that same way, though, in the 1990s and then most recently in the last few years. But the Watergate scandal leads to Nixon's resignation. It leads to the collapse of the Nixon presidency. His vice president, a man named Gerald Ford, takes office at the moment that Nixon resigns. And Ford will go on to pardon Nixon. One of his very first actions as president will be to pardon Richard Nixon for any and all crimes that he may or may not have done. This ends up leading to a lot of criticism of Ford. His presidency is not terribly eventful. It doesn't last very long, barely 2 years. The economy is still suffering from inflation. It still suffers a fairly significant recession. His successor is Jimmy Carter, who was governor of Georgia. Carter is still dealing with very similar kinds of economic problems. There are additional problems with the supply of oil from the Middle East. Oil prices skyrocket in the late 1970s, which contributes to another recession. Ongoing problems with inflation as the cost of a lot of different goods and services increase. So this is a serious problem for Carter to try to face. He is, in terms of the way that he handles his presidency, he is very much a micromanager. So he doesn't really succeed in addressing the economic problems. His personal moral compass leads him to be much more concerned about human rights issues abroad than many previous presidents had been. But he runs directly up against a very, very complicated world situation as the Soviet Union begins to kind of flex its muscles again. widespread issues with terrorism internationally, in Europe and in the Middle East. The thing that really sort of symbolizes the Carter presidency is the Iranian Revolution. That happens in 1979. Basically, the emperor, I guess you could say, of Iran, a guy is, he's the Shah of Iran. He is toppled, he's ousted, he's basically driven out of Iran, and he's given refuge in the United States for a while for medical treatment. This outrages the Iranians, who believe that this is sort of contradictory to the American statements in support of human rights, etc., because the Shah was not a very good person, did some very evil things. So Iranians then storm the embassy in Tehran. They take 60 people hostage, 60 Americans hostage, and they are held for over a year until the inauguration of Ronald Reagan in January of 1981. This is really in many ways kind of symbolic of Carter's difficulties as president, right? Certainly he has domestic concerns with the economy, but certainly he also struggles to navigate a very gray world, right? In terms of wanting to achieve black and white solutions to problems that the world faces, but the world is not black and white, and President Carter has a real hard time sort of navigating those waters in a lot of ways. And the Iran-Contra, or the Iran hostage situation, Iran-Contra is a different thing. The Iran hostage situation is definitely going to be a moment when the country sort of transitions from Carter into Reagan. And the Reagan election is going to be the place where we'll start then in the next section when we get to it, because Reagan really represents a very different kind of approach politically, both to foreign affairs and to domestic affairs. And so, excuse me, that'll be the kickoff point of our next topic. Please make sure that you're looking over all of the PowerPoints. Please let me know if you've got questions about anything that I can help with. And I will see everybody soon.